And we are going. Thank you, Leah. So hello, everyone. As I said before, my name is Courtney Muma, and I am the Deputy Director of Texas Digital Library. We're very happy to have you with us today to join us for one of our most recent topics in research data management. This has been a free webinar series hosted by the Texas Data Repository Steering Committee that we have been doing for just about 2 years now. And we're very proud of what we've been able to do so far. And so forgive me if you've seen this already many times this week, but I want to give you a quick intro to Zoom to help you out a bit. So first, I want to point out just a few things in the Zoom interface. We're going to ask that everyone who's not speaking, please stay muted. So you would have been muted when you entered the room. If you have unmuted yourself, just remute yourself, and that's down in this left-hand corner, although we acknowledge some of you might have different interfaces depending on the devices which you've used to log in. Your video should also be off as much as you're comfortable. We love to see your faces, however, so certainly in this beginning I've got mine on so I can wave hello to everyone, but I'll be shutting mine off to allow for the most bandwidth for Sebastian's discussion. You can see everybody's who is here by clicking on the participants, and you can use that chat function throughout the webinar to plop your questions in. So any question that occurs to you, go ahead and put it in chat, and Alex, Leah, Laura Waugh of the TDR Steering Committee and myself will do our best to keep track of those questions, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And again, if you do have questions during this, both Leah and Alex are watching email, so you can just email info@tdl.org and they'll help you out if you're having trouble logging in. So just a real quick intro to the Texas Data Repository. So the Texas Data Repository is a multi-tenant Dataverse application that allows for citation, management, storage, and exploration of research data. We have 10 members using it at the Texas Digital Library right now, and we're part of the Global Dataverse Community Consortium, which just started about a year ago. And the TDR has existed for just over 3 years now. This series, the Topics in Research Data Management, is owned by the Texas Data Repository Steering Committee, the superheroes who really steer what we do with Dataverse, how we manage it, how we train each other, how we support each other in our use of the Dataverse here in Texas. Their work has been outstanding, and this webinar series is only a small portion of it. We have recorded all of the webinars so far, except for one unfortunate one that we couldn't record because of a technical error. However, we do have the videos and we do have all the slides, even for that one we weren't able to record, available in the Texas Digital Library's digital repository online. We've had presentations from the likes of the Odom Institute, Carnegie Mellon, and of course today we've got the Qualitative Data Repository represented. So without any further ado, I want to introduce to you Sebastian Karcher, who is Associate Director of the Qualitative Data Repository at Syracuse University. We're very proud to have you with us, Sebastian, today. We appreciate you taking time out on a Friday to talk to us. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now and hand over to you, and I'll come back for the Q&A management at the end.
All right. Thanks so much, Courtney. And thanks everyone for showing up. I'm seeing about 40 people, which is really exciting. So I'll be talking about curating qualitative data mainly. I'll also give a little bit of history and background on the Qualitative Data Repository, which is the institution at which I work and where we do curate qualitative research data. So in the US, of course, we have this rich landscape of social science data repositories. That's quite old, right? The Local Public Opinion Archive goes back to 47, ICPSR, the big social science data archive, 1962, IPMS in Minnesota, 1989, the Odom Institute that was mentioned. It's actually, as an institute, super old. They're like in the 1920s, I think, originally. Their data archive is also kind of goes back to the 60s or 70s. So long and rich tradition of social science data archives. They were used for mainly large studies originally. So if you look at the early stuff in ICPSR, these are mainly large studies. And then in political science, which is institutionally very important for QDR, and I'll get to that, calls for data sharing started fairly early. So we have this landmark article that everyone in political science knows. It's called Replication. It's a bit of an unfortunate misnomer. He's actually talking about what we now mostly call reproducibility or computational reproducibility. As early as 1995, people have been talking about data sharing and transparency since then. And then in 2012, a very strong standard for data sharing was introduced into the American Political Science ethics guideline. And that specified not just that researchers should share data, but also that they should share their research data through trusted digital repositories. But all that infrastructure that I pointed to was really focused on quantitative data, lots of survey data, especially in the social sciences, some other data like coded quantitative data. There's also has been, at least in political science and in a number of social sciences, been a bit of an uneasy divide between qualitative and quantitative researchers, with qualitative researchers feeling pushed out, feeling that the way they do research or they even view the world isn't given justice by trends in the discipline. There are separate sections for qualitative research in the American Political Science Association. And again, we see similar things in other disciplines. At Syracuse here, we host a dedicated training institute, the Institute for Qualitative and Multi-Method Research, almost every summer, not this summer, unfortunately. So there is this big group of qualitative researchers that really didn't feel that the existing repository landscape did them any justice. And someone needs to mute themselves, please. The Qualitative Data Repository really came out of that and was founded, and I think that's kind of special about who we are and what we do. It was founded by political scientists reacting to that. They started talking in the early 2010s and then started getting seed funding. I think the first round goes back to 2011. And then QDR has been online since 2014, initially with just NSF funding. You see the mission statement there on the slide. We have our headquarters here at Syracuse University and a small team working here. We have one person in the leadership who is a faculty at Georgetown. And then we work very closely with a team led by Carol Palmer and Nick Weber at the iSchool at the University of Washington, Seattle, who mainly do oversee the technical side, but we really work very closely hand in hand. As I said, we were originally in political science, but especially over the last 2 years, we've been branching out significantly and now have data from all sorts of different disciplines. We get a lot of public health data. We have sociology, anthropology, geography. I'm probably missing some still, but you get the sense, right? We're broadening in disciplinary scope. We're also very international in scope. So while the majority of our data is from the US, we definitely have 5 continents represented. So we have data from Latin American scholars, we have data from Australian scholars, we have data from African scholars, European scholars, Asian scholars. I don't know if I'm at 5 or 6 now. But again, from all over the world. That said, we're still relatively small, though growing fairly quickly. So currently we have 76 data projects published, and our growth rate right now is about 2 to 3 a month. They vary widely in scope. So this goes from, maybe 10 to 12 interview transcripts to projects with up to 2,500 files in them. Again, someone needs to mute themselves, please. So just to give you a sense about the types of data that we have, at the bottom left, you see our bread and butter. So this is an interview transcript, in this case from a focus group. That's probably about half of the projects that we have are interview-based. Next to that, at the right, there's the scribbling. It's one of my favorite pieces of evidence that we have. It's from a project about presidential decision-making and foreign policy views. This is a page from JFK's diaries, and we have a fair amount of digitized archival materials that researchers share through QDR. Next to that, we have a screenshot from a video. So these are presidential campaign videos. Videos is another area where we have limited but quite interesting set of information. And then at the bottom right is also something we have a fair amount. This is a page from kind of, I call this gray literature. So this is a publication by a Mexican municipality on water treatment. And so these types of documents are quite common in what researchers share through QDR. So what makes qualitative data special? Why do we need a separate data repository? There are some sociological reasons that I kind of hinted at, right, about disciplinary differences, but there's also some actual stuff that's different, that requires different procedures and slightly different expertise. One big thing is that not just has there not been a repository, with some exceptions, think about oral history, think about some pockets of anthropology for some time, there's really not much of a tradition of sharing qualitative data, which means that researchers don't really know how this is supposed to look. There are very few standards for how qualitative social science data that is shared should look. There are also some particular challenges related to qualitative human participant data that I'll talk about. Something that's somewhat unique to qualitative data is copyright. A lot of quantitative data doesn't, or at least arguably doesn't fall under copyright because it's not creative, it's factual information that's by US copyright law. That's almost never the case for qualitative data. And then there is just generally, in many cases, a different way to think about the relationship between research and data, the relationship between researcher and data, the relationship between text, publication, and data that require different models. So for the lack of tradition, one of the things that we actually spend a lot of time on and that we see as core of what we do as curation is teaching people about managing and sharing qualitative data. So one thing that we're particularly proud of and that you should all check out is a course that we released this January, February, jointly with the Social Science Research Council on Managing Qualitative Social Science Data. You can see the URL at the bottom of that image. That's a free, self-guided, open licensed course that really goes through from the planning stage through writing a data management plan, to thinking about how do I share my data, to how do I write with my data. So kind of through the entire research data life cycle, and designed originally for SSRC fellows, which are typically graduate students doing intensive fieldwork, but hopefully useful to anyone who does qualitative research and who wants to learn more about using the data. We regularly teach workshops. So this is a workshop that we teach at the Institute for Qualitative and Multi-Method Research. We teach at a variety of conferences. So we've had versions of that at the Educational Research Associations. We were going to be at the Population Association, so the Demographers Conference. We're going to try to do that online. We regularly at APSA, the American Political Science Conference, with a version of that. etc. Was there a question? We also do regular webinars. This one I designed mostly with kind of curators in mind, but we do versions of this that are much more targeted towards researchers. So this is one example. The other thing that we do a lot is guidance and consultations. We have a ton of guidance materials on our website. This is qdr.syr.edu about relevant topics for qualitative researchers. But perhaps even more importantly, we just answer a lot of questions. So this is the kind of a standard one that we'd be getting, right? I am in the process of submitting an NSF grant for a qualitative research project, and I'm working on my DMP. And anyone here who works in a research data kind of support position will have dealt with similar questions. I'm sure, and kind of where our strengths come in is that we really have a deep understanding of qualitative research and of the particular challenges with that data, and by now also of the thinking of various NSF directorates. So for NSF data management plans in particular, we think we can give very sound advice, and in some cases also find NSF pointing to QDR directly to get researchers the advice that they need to effectively plan for data management and then plan for sharing wherever that's possible. We also do this as much as we can in offering consultations at conferences and summer institutes. So this was from an email that we sent out to those summer institute participants. We had similar things again at AERA, the Education Research Association, the American Political Science Association. So the idea there is create low barriers for researchers to talk to someone who understands both qualitative data and data management as early as possible to help them get an understanding, okay, what sorts of things should I be doing now that will make my life easier later on as I think about sharing my data. And I've spent a fair amount of time talking about this. We spend a lot of time thinking about this. We spend a lot of time doing this, and where this works well, it also, it means we get more data. So it creates, in one sense, more work, but in effect, it actually creates less work for us because we get better data. We have data that is easier to work with because the researchers have done a lot of the crucial steps that we typically have to check or try to fix somehow already while they were collecting their data. So, right, if we don't do this, we get data that kind of looks like that. That's shared with the permission of the actual researcher who is now doing a much, much, much better job. Or even worse, we get something like this, right? And I'm going to talk more about this, but we often find consent that essentially stops data sharing in its track, right? When you've promised your participants that you'll destroy all the information you collected for them at the end, you can't then put it in a digital repository and share it. And that's the type of thing that we can prevent from happening if people talk to us early enough. So human participant data. Obviously, most all social science works with human participant data. That's what makes it social. But qualitative data is still different in many ways. There's often a much closer relationship between researcher and participants. So for my dissertation, I did elite interviews, but even there, some people I talked to 2 or 3 times, sometimes in somewhat informal settings. There was, a relationship of trust that's very different from, say, the more detached relationship between a survey designer who's kind of 2 steps apart from the person who actually fills out the survey or answers the survey questions. The setting is also often less formal, right? So in my case, we still were mostly in an office or at least in a coffee shop. But if you're doing ethnography, you're trying to get people kind of as they go about their everyday life. So it may be hard to even get kind of traditional informed consent. you may be just kind of informally chatting. The border between what's research and what's, making friends is fluid, so tricky. Also, de-identification, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, is particularly tricky. Those of you who've been following the census discussion have heard a lot about differential privacies and the various sophisticated technical methods in which we can make very rich quantitative data safe to access without compromising participants' personal information. That's much harder, at least in a semi-automated way, to do with qualitative data. So some of the things that we do. One thing that we do, and that we found out earlier was quite important, whenever someone comes to us with interview data, the first thing we ask them about is their informed consent script. And in many cases, that's the point where we have to say, we're really not comfortable publishing these transcripts on QDR. And researchers often understand that. But one thing that maybe shouldn't have surprised it, but did surprise us, is how unfamiliar many researchers are with the informed consent that they use. So we probably know that our participants often don't fully understand the informed consent, and that's another whole set of problems that raises. But it's even the case that the researchers themselves are often not quite aware of what they're using. And a lot of what we still find people using is quite restrictive as it pertains to data sharing. We find a lot of language about destroying data, a lot of language about viewing data being limited to project participants. There are changes about this. One change comes from the IRBs, and I'm going to talk about that. One change also comes from the latest revision of the common rule, where at least as some interpret it, informed consent should contain a specific statement about whether or whether not data will be reused, and that should produce some improvements. One area that we are, in fact, working on is to work together with IRBs to provide some good language that we can suggest people that IRBs think is good, but also, and that's crucial, for IRBs to suggest to participants, because often participants will not come to the data repository first, but they will go to the IRB because they can't actually do human participant research without going to the IRB. So if the standard IRB templates have good language on data sharing, and that language doesn't always have to be, I'll share all the data, right? We can talk about this in the Q&A, but the language has to be responsible and thought out. And in some cases, that may actually be that the data won't be shared, but that shouldn't be the default. That should be upon reflection of what sorts of restrictions need to be placed on the data. And again, I have a link to some of the language that we're currently recommending as general templates. And about de-identification. So what makes this so tricky is you have to actually read through the text. There's so much deep contextual information contained in qualitative interviews that you can't just, go through, write an automated tool that scrubs, names. Sure, you can do that, but then a lot of things you can use together, right? So people may mention a location, a year, those sorts of things. And then you need to be able to say, is this highly disclosive? Is it not? Often there are trade-off, right? If you de-identify 1 year or 1 location, then something else might be OK. If you don't, then taken together with another bit of information that might be identifying. I purposefully put a Spanish transcript here. So if you don't speak Spanish, that's already a problem there. In this case, there's a good example, right? So you need to know, right, municipio. So the city here, I de-identify. I need to understand what's the CONABIP. Is that something I need to de-identify? In this case, they decided it isn't. It's a national organization for libraries. So that seems fine. But right, this means as we curate this, it's often actually a collaboration between us and the depositors. We tell them, here are some strategies, but you really need to go through your transcripts. This is not something we can do for you. We can run some checks. We can look at things and say, this looks maybe problematic. But in the end, you need to tell us things about your research setting, about your field site, et cetera, that helps us decide whether something is disclosive or not. So I've mentioned we are working with IRBs, and that's actually an ongoing research projects that are led by some of my colleagues, especially Desi Kirilova. It's pronounced WIZARD. It's a great acronym, working with sensitive research data. Some of the work is NSF funded and jointly with the ICPSR. And the big idea is here to bring together different stakeholders, and especially in its current stage, IRBs and data repositories, also researchers, to create mutual awareness, what's going on, what are recent trends, how are we thinking about these things. For example, we looked at IRB guidance. We did focus groups with people at IRBs at research-intensive universities. The first thing that we actually worked on was this consent language, because it keeps coming up over and over again. Something that we're currently working on is working with restricted data, which is something that IRBs understand very little of, and that data repositories are investing a lot in. But if we can't get people to deposit restricted data because IRBs don't fully understand it, that's a problem. So that's an area where we're currently working with both IRBs and increasingly researchers, because then if you think back to the informed consent, researchers need to be able to convey to participant what does restricted access mean, which is interesting, but also quite a challenge. I'm not actually looking at the chat, but I saw like 10 messages popping up. So I want to pause briefly and see if there are any questions that I should maybe take now.
If you're willing to, I can read a few to you, Sebastian. Is that
Yeah.
all right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thanks for pausing. So the first question was fairly straightforward. When is the demographers conference that you mentioned?
The PAA was for April 22nd through 26th. And we're hoping to do our workshop remotely on the 22nd, but we haven't gotten the green light from PAA for that yet. And that is actually done together with public health researchers from the Guttmacher Institute. So it's kind of a mixed practical researcher repository perspective that we're doing there.
Gotcha, thank you. You want another one? There are two more. Do you want to take these now or at the end?
Yeah, let's do them now.
Okay, so one is, do you have guidance for researchers about wording their ethics review and for the informed consent documents? So I think you shared some links there.
Yeah, so that slide with informed consent has the informed consent language. We don't have recommended language for the IRB proper beyond the informed consent. So if that comes up, we're always interested. As you see, we have a whole page full of templates. So if people are interested in that, we're happy to develop something. But that part has never come up as a question beyond the informed consent, for which we have a couple of different scenarios.
And just so you know too, Sebastian, I'm trying my best to catch your links and also drop them into the chat. But for everyone listening, we'll also have access to these slides, and we'll be providing them for you for reference afterwards in concurrence with the recording. There's one more question, and then we can have you go on, Sebastian, if you're willing.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, can one start their own data curation services, or should it always be in an academic environment?
Well, one can do all sorts of things. I mean, I think data curation services can absolutely be done by individuals, right? Like you could work as a freelance consultant. Some large research projects, including at the corporate level, so not academic, have their own data curators. So who exactly does the curation services isn't set in stone. I would say in terms of the data repository proper, you want some sort of stable infrastructure, right? And universities have been around for a couple of hundred years, even in the US, or we're getting close to 1,000 if you look at European universities. So they're pretty good at keeping things around. So in terms of storing the data, that's probably not a bad place. But in terms of curating the data, absolutely none. That could happen in a non-academic setting or semi-academic setting. And some private companies, so publishers, for example, are offering curation services. I know many on this call are probably skeptical of this. I certainly am, but it is something that happens and that can clearly be done.
Thanks, Sebastian. That's everything for now. And I'll keep track in the chat for the rest of the questions as they come in.
Cool. So one thing that researchers, qualitative researchers, very keenly aware of human participants issues. Qualitative researchers are not at all aware of copyright issues, which is particularly problematic because virtually all qualitative data falls under copyright, right? If you just have a spreadsheet, a bunch of numbers, factual information, at least in the US, arguably that doesn't fall under copyright. There's, I'm not a copyright lawyer. There's lots of debates of when composing this as a database does constitute creative work, etc. For qualitative data, though, there's no debate, right? If someone writes a long text, if someone publishes a report, all those sorts of things, clearly under copyright. If you look at organizations' websites, clearly under copyright. So a lot of what we do is copyright assessments, and we work with SU's copyright librarian, who is currently, I think they're looking for one, so if you know a good copyright librarian. So we used to work with SU's fantastic copyright librarian, and now we're probably reaching out to other people and using any resource that we find. What's very helpful, of course, is stuff that's in the public domain. So old document, most 19th century things are in the public domain. Then if you go international, the laws change all over the place. Government documents, the rules are, again, very different by country. In the US, very broadly, federal government stuff tends to be in the public domain. Other countries, that's much more narrowly focused on laws, those sorts of things. Where we think something is absolutely critical for a data project, and it's really kind of maybe just a snippet of a document, etc. We do fair use assessments as an archive. We don't like doing that because of the massive gray area that fair use operates in. So we try not to take data under fair use a lot, but we occasionally do it when we feel pretty good about it and where the data is fairly crucial. We do a fair amount of asking for permission, and that's actually quite interesting. So for newspapers in the US, that's mostly pointless because they all have their monetizing strategies. But in Latin America, a lot of newspapers just have paper archives and have no real plans to monetize them. And we've had, I think now, 3 researchers go to major Latin American newspapers where they'd worked in the archive and asked permission to share selections of something like between 50 and 300 or so digitized newspaper articles, and they've said yes every single time. So asking permission without any fees associated. So asking permission is often feasible, and it's really cool when it works because that's obviously data that's really interesting. It's often crucial for current research, and it's incredibly hard to get to if you're not, spending data in spending time in Lima, going into the newspaper archives, etc. The asking permissions, and this is not really copyright, but one thing that is also, of course, good practice to do, and that we also have a template on and we advise researchers on, is when they do archival research or when they've done archival research, to always check with the archive how the archive feels about republishing digitized copies of what is in the archives. Some archives have very explicit written rules about that. Some archives are big sticklers about that. If you've ever worked in the German National Archives, they have like super strict rules about what all the things you cannot do, and you have to ask permission for every single document, and then you can only have it at 80 DPI, and it's like, they have strict rules. As I'm German, so I can make fun of us for that. The US National Archives, where documents aren't under copyright, are kind of on the opposite end of that. They tend to be very generous with allowing for digital copies of their holdings to be published elsewhere. And then other archives for anywhere on that spectrum. But always good to ask unless something is written on the website already, as it is for NAR. So as a archive, and as the only archive in the US that is really focused solely on qualitative and multi-method data, one thing that we try to do is kind of push the frontiers. These are three areas in which we've done a lot of thinking and a good amount of work. One is we've improved the repository that we work with for qualitative data. The second is an initiative where we thought about how transparency could look for qualitative research that we call Annotation for Transparent Inquiry, or ATI. And then we are starting to look more closely at how can we archive and share the outputs of qualitative data analysis software products, such as Todo, Setlist TI, and Vivo, et cetera. So let me talk about all three of these briefly. So Dataverse is the fantastic repository software that TDL uses, that QDR uses, and that about 46, I think, other data repositories around the world use. It's centrally developed at Harvard at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, and that will become relevant in a second. But increasingly also with contributions from a worldwide user base, and by users in this case I mean the actual repositories running the software. The word Dataverse is kind of a terminological disaster, because Dataverse, A, means the software, B, often is used to refer to the Harvard installation of the software, which is a free to use self-deposit repository, and then they, to make things even more complicated, introduced within a Dataverse repository. You can have multiple Dataverses, which other people would maybe call collections, and at QDR we actually call collection because we found the number of Dataverses confusing. So I'm talking about the software here. I have a blog post about this that goes into more details. But two things that I wanted to flag is Dataverse, again, coming out of quantitative social sciences, does a really nice job of letting you work with quantitative data. They have some analysis tools in which you can go into spreadsheets and look at them and look at questions and frequency distributions in the questions. Depending on the installation, you can even run some regression models on the variables in a quantitative data set. So really cool for quantitative data. You can do absolutely nothing with the standard formats you could do absolutely nothing with the standard formats our researchers work with. So PDFs with text files, image files, etc. So we did two things. One thing is we built in full text search. That wasn't terribly hard, but any reasonably easy to index text files, so Word docs, PDF files, text files, HTML files, we index and then make full text searchable. A lot of QDR data is restricted to registered users, which meant we had to think about how do we make that data, those search results available. So one of the things the way we solve this is that you can see only the search results where you can actually access the files. That took a little bit of extra development, but it means much easier to actually find what you're looking for in QDR. The other thing that we did is we built a set of really lightweight viewers. So for example, when you have a video file, it used to be that you needed to download it this particular file is 450 megabytes. Most people are on fast-ish internet, so it's still pretty massive if you just kind of want to check out what's going on. Now you can click a preview button, and an HTML5-based viewer pops up, and you can just quickly watch the video in your browser and then decide if you want to download it and the 20 other videos in this particular collection. The full text search, definitely the first part. I think both parts now are in the generic Dataverse code. So see, you would be able to benefit from that code at the Texas Digital Repository and other Dataverse installations. Again, the beauty of open source. The data viewers are also now under the custody of the global organization of Dataverse repositories, and possible to roll out, and I think included in a number of Dataverses. Courtney would have to say if TDR already has this available, but it's fairly easy to do. So this benefits QDR directly, that's why we invested in it, but it also benefits other repositories that may have qualitative or qualitative type or multi-method holdings. So the second thing is, as we were, if you recall the beginning of my talk, one of the things that QDR came out of is move towards reproducibility. And reproducibility in quantitative research, or research transparency in quantitative research, has a fairly clear model, right? So you have a table, a matrix, then you take some code, and that code produces a table or a figure in the article. And then you put the code in and the table into a data repository, and you have open science, and everyone is happy. Not always quite as simple, but as a general model, this is exactly how it works. And in many cases, it works beautifully like that. Qualitative research often proceeds very differently. So this is, say, case study research. You have maybe a statement, and then you have a couple of sources that you analyze, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, and then sometimes you put them maybe in a footnote. And then you go to the next statement, and then you repeat that 30, 40, 50, 60 times in an article, and your quantitative model for transparency doesn't really work. And so what we do with ATI is we take the article, and on the left side of the screen, you see the PDF as it's actually published on the publisher's site. And then we use the open source hypothesis tool and put an digital overlay on top of that article, where the author annotates specific sentences where they feel an empirical statement or an argument, et cetera, needs additional evidence. And so you can see several components here. So what we call an analytic note, that's kind of, if you go back here, perhaps what's in that analysis box. So a little bit of explanation, what am I looking at, why is it important? Then an excerpt, so the key part of the document that I'm analyzing, of the piece of evidence that I'm analyzing. Wherever possible, a direct link to the evidence, typically on the data repository, in this case QDR, and then where relevant, a full citation. So here, these are national, these are Telegram in the National Archives in the UK. So this does a lot of things, right? It doesn't mess with how you read the original article, because you can just toggle out the annotations, but it allows you to go deeper. It gives you insight into how the sources were used. It gives you direct access to the sources where they were difficult to access. So we're very excited about that. We got one round of grant funding from RWJF to test this out, run some pilots. And we just got another grant for this from the NSF that will allow us to build some more tools to make this a little easier for both researchers and repositories to use, and again, test those out. So we're very pleased with that. And I have a bit.ly link here at the top that allows you to explore this particular data project. We also have a bunch more examples and all sorts of different things on our page. So, right, so this is perhaps the most typical case where the archival data, where there's archival data underlying this. But we have examples where ethnographers put photos from their field site in those annotations. We have a particular fun one from sociolinguists where we have the sound files of the actual people and the accents they're talking about. And these are Scottish fishing village accents, so they're absolutely fantastic. So very broad band of usage of how these API annotations can be used. And I'm happy to talk about this at great length. Finally, and this is mainly looking ahead, qualitative data analysis software has been around for a while. It's becoming increasingly common across the social and social type sciences. We find, depending on the discipline, somewhere between 40 and 90% of qualitative researchers working with some of these tools. This is a screenshot from in vivo, so you see those different excerpts in there. It's really rich data, right? You have the underlying data sources, but you also have the way the researchers coded them. You often have additional documentation in the form of memos, say. You have some organizational scheme often embedded in the data. Documents may be tagged. So there's a lot going on here and a lot of rich information, a type of rich information that we love to capture and make available from the archive end. One big problem is that all the major tools that researchers use are proprietary. There are some open source alternatives, and Wiki Steves and Beth, blanking on her last name, gave a great seminar, a workshop online for iAssist on open source tools that is available online that you can find. I don't know if someone knows where it is. Maybe you can post a link. But most tools are proprietary, and most researchers use those proprietary tools that are also quite powerful, but too difficult to use, right? What exactly do we store? How many researchers does it actually benefit if we store one particular proprietary format? And even worse, how do we ensure digital preservation, right? We can't really know how to migrate those formats. We don't really know how long they're going to remain stable. So they're kind of your standard proprietary digital preservation nightmare. So happily, and I hope you like my combination of the pop culture reference and the UML illustration of it, we have a new standard that most of the major software vendors now support. So REFI-QDA, REFI stands for Rotterdam Exchange Format Initiative, is an XML-based format that major vendors, including in vivo Atlas Divide, Reduce, and MaxQDA, all support as an export format that captures not all, but most of the types of information included in these sorts of data projects. We consulted with the group that pulled that together at various points on what can we do, how can this be maximally useful for archives, how can we incentivize researchers to make this available for archives. And it's an area where we expect to be doing a fair amount more work over the next 3-4 years. Also have a grant pending on this, so hopefully be able to put some resources to this. But it's a really exciting area because the UK Data Archive, who has been a pioneer really in sharing qualitative data, had tried to do this about 10 years ago. There is an old 2011, I think, article by Louis Cordy on sharing QDAS data, but they were never able to get that sort of vendor buy-in. And now this group, for which QDR, to be clear, takes absolutely no credit, but this group of researchers and software developers was able to develop this rich standard, and now we think we're actually going to be able to make massive progress there in storing, sharing, and making available to the last thing I want to talk about for a couple of minutes is how QDR survives. QDR is not doesn't have guaranteed funding from Syracuse University, so it's not like a library institutional repository, which is backed by an institution's library. So we need to think about, how do we make sure that the data that are stored in QDR are available for the long term. We do have a lot of grant funding. We got initial seed funding. We're very successful applying for grants. We currently have NSF and Sloan grants. We had RWJF grants in the past. We've gotten recently new grant funding. So very successful on that end. But grant funding is, of course, a very risky business model. And you also typically have to claim to be doing something novel in order to get grant funding, which repositories are ideally kind of conservative in what we do, in that the core of our existence is, take stuff and keep it safe for a really, really, really long time. So to ensure that, we have two separate additional revenue streams. One is individual deposit and curation fees. So this is, think of it as an analog to the author pays model of Gold Open Access. The fees range widely. So $300 is kind of your simple 30 interviews or so project. And then $10,000 is, I think, the highest we've ever written as an estimate that involves lots of consultation, huge data amounts, etc. We've had some people just pay this out of their research budget. The standard way we envision this is that it gets written into grants, and most of you will know that the standard granting agencies encourage researchers to write data management and storage costs into their grants. So a small chunk of your NSF grant, say your NIH grant, would go to QDR for us to be able to provide the curation services and then to ensure long-term preservation. The other thing that we're doing is institutional membership. And this originally was intended to work just like ICPSR. So you get membership, and then you have your researchers have access to all the data. And then as we were thinking more about this, we felt this was the wrong approach. We wanted to make sure that all data in QDR is always available free of charge to anyone who wants access to it. So we flipped that model. Instead of giving member researchers free access, we give member institutions heavily discounted access to our curation and storage services in exchange for providing a stable source of income for us. So we've got a good number of libraries, including the UT Austin library that are members. I think we're currently at like 25 or 26 after 1 year. Mostly it's academic libraries. We have some institutes. So the Odium Institute actually manages the membership for UNC. And we have some other organizations, some of them non-university, and some of them cross-university organizations that are members. And so we're quite flexible with who can become a member. And more information, again, I have a link for that, and I'm happy to talk more about. And now we have a little bit of time left for questions.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. That was jam-packed full of really fascinating information. I'm going to have to step off in about 2 minutes, but I'm going to ask you the one question that's currently in chat before I go. The only reason I have to leave early is I have, of course, another meeting right up against this one. And so rather than put my farewell slides up right now, I will leave that to one of my colleagues, and I'll leave yours here for the minute. Thank you for providing us access to you in so many ways. I appreciate it. So the question that's outstanding right now in chat is, what do you do for researchers who want to share their data, but who are using proprietary tools?
Yeah, so increasingly we are able to tell them export to that new format, which is really cool. currently, for the people who came to us, say with in vivo data from 3 years ago, we thought with them through kind of what the most useful export would be. So that would typically be the individual data files, and then things like node export from in vivo, or something that gives people who want to reuse the data some sense of what's in the data. We're also, of course, able to do bit level preservation of those proprietary formats. So for in vivo, that would be your .npv files. Those are a little bit tricky to export and store without also exporting a bunch of stuff that you may not want to share. So we haven't gotten a lot of uptake on that. But give us the data files, and then the most relevant codecs or node exports, depending on the software, has been a reasonably useful format. But it's much less cool than being able to give other people the project and then allow them to read that into their QDA software, which is why I'm so excited about that new format.
And I'll ask my question as I exit, and I'll have to listen to the answer in the recording. But on behalf of our TDR users, and especially our steering committee, one of the things that I noted is your discussion on the fact that it hasn't been a tradition to share qualitative data. And we all know that. I think you're entering into this kind of Dataverse world. What some of our users are finding is there's a big leap between that tradition and getting people to see the value of the sharing. And so I hope you can address just for a minute how you've been handling that. And with that, I'll sign off, but either Leah or Alex will close us out. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, so getting users to see the value, is tricky, right? So there's a number of things that I think are helpful. One is there are some push factors, if you want, right? The NSF requires it for grants, and they're getting increasingly strict. Some journals require it, so we get a fair number of deposits from people who want to publish in the PLOS family of journals, and PLOS is fairly strict in their interpretation of their data policy. That's okay, but I'm always a little hesitant about just the push factors. So how do you motivate people to do it? Some of the best data we have is really people who have this wide range of data that they're really proud of, and they feel their publication only reflects a small amount of that. So that's one big motivation. Another big motivation is researchers that are steeped in that open science tradition, and that's currently still more often true for multi-method researchers, so for people who also do quantitative research, but we see more qualitative researchers coming in that new kind of open science tradition, and who really want to provide the access to their thinking and their sources to the widest degree possible, and see the intrinsic value in that, and understand that as part of their ethos. And that's, of course, great people to work with, and we've got some super interesting projects by that. There is, the self-interest. We have some evidence that, including for qualitative data, projects with shared data get cited, publications with shared data get cited more, those sorts of things. One big thing is training, right? And when I talk about the pedagogy, right, if you get researchers used to think about how and which of your data can get shared, not once they're associate professors in their 40s, but once they're graduate students or even smart undergraduate students in their late or mid-20s, that's a much better point to catch people in their career and convince them that this is something they should be thinking about. And lastly, one thing that is just a fascinating publication that came out in the journal Research and Ethics by a number of qualitative health researchers, that found that a lot of people that you talk to, so interview participants, actually assume that the data is going to be shared with other researchers when you do qualitative studies. So right, there has been this assumption, I need to protect my participants, but I think doing what the participants want, in many cases, is actually one of the strongest reasons to share data. And I think that's something that once we can show researchers there. And once we get them into the habit of talking to their participants about this, they will find the same. And I think that will convince a lot of people. So that's optimistic me.
Thanks, Sebastian. This is Leah with TDL, taking over for Courtney since she had to step away. I don't believe I see any new questions in chat, but if I've missed you, then I do apologize. If you do have a question, please go ahead and type it into chat. I see we're just a minute or two past 2 o'clock. I want to thank you all for joining us today too, and especially Sebastian. That was a really wonderful webinar, and so far this is, I think, the last webinar of the series until we get a few more on deck. So it's a perfect bookend.
All right. Thanks so much for having me, and please be in touch with any questions you come up with.
We sure will. Thanks, Sebastian. Hope everyone has a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye.